Ryan Stanton here with ASAP Frontline, today with a local home gamer. We are here in Salt Lake City, and Dr. Jim Dahle is here with us. And so we're right here in your backyard, the quick commute in, theoretically quick commute, apparently for you too, quick commute from home today. So appreciate it. Thanks for being here. Thanks for hosting ASAP.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here. It's great to have ASAP come to my hometown. I was so excited to get down here today that I apparently put a little too much heavy foot, and I got to meet one of our wonderful law enforcement officers this morning on the way in.
Put a little too much pepper on the eggs. But, you are probably the most recognized face with regard, and voice, with regard to finances, finances for physicians. We've done a number of podcasts before, so definitely search those out, check them out. But the white coat investor, all right? And so right now you're going to get sneak peek behind the curtain, all these types of things that he talked about here, a combination of 2 lectures and a workshop here locally. But I think one of the most important things we want to start off with is, young physicians, we're already starting behind the 8 ball. And I think actually that was the first thing we talked about, is the fact you mentioned that, all your friends started at age 20, 23. We started age 30, something like that. That money never catches up. So it's very difficult, and so it's very purposeful with emergency physicians or physicians in general, that once you do start to get a decent paycheck, or actually even before, because with the resident-based numbers, there's some opportunities there. But what are some of the things that early physicians need to know and do to kind of get themselves off on the right foot, to where you're not having to work shifts when you're 70 years old, and you can choose to work them when you're 70 if you want to?
Well, it's even worse than not starting until you're 30 or 35 instead of 22. You're also starting with some student loans usually. 75% of physicians are coming out of med school with student loans these days, $200,000, $300,000, $400,000. So your net worth's literally worse than zero. You're worse than broke when you start your career out. I mean, just getting back to broke is a significant milestone for most physicians. So let's not, underestimate just how tough it is to be a young physician these days. But some of the things to pay attention to early in your career are not necessarily investing in building wealth yet. It's more protecting yourself, right? One of the things I emphasize to resident physicians is you got to have insurance. If somebody's dependent on your income, besides you got to have some term life insurance, and probably a whole bunch of it. And unless you're already financially independent or have somebody else that can support you if you get disabled, you need disability insurance. And way too many people are running around with not nearly enough liability insurance. I have a neighbor that his spouse hit somebody and totaled their car, and then he discovered that the state minimums for insurance amounts are less than the value of that car, much less the injured occupants. And so we just don't pay enough attention to insurance early on. Another problem for young doctors, they just don't have a plan for those student loans. If you are owing $200,000 or $300,000 or $400,000 in student loans, you really got to understand what you're doing with them, what your plan is to get rid of them. And that can be challenging for people as well, especially with all the changes this summer in student loan management because of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act.
So you mentioned, and that's a great analogy, because you're right. It's you're not even just at the beginning of the runway. The plane isn't even put together yet. Trying to catch back up and get to the point that you're ready for takeoff. What are some of the, you talked about before, and let's hit on it, because I think it's important. Because I think as a resident physician, you're thinking about just surviving. You're thinking about, can't wait till I'm done, get a job, get a nice car, get a big house, all those things. There are some opportunities as residents before you get to that 6-figure salary that you can do that really can boost your potential down the road. Do you recommend at that point that as a resident, you're paying off the school loans versus getting involved with some of the investment opportunities that are more designed for the under 6-figure crowd?
Well, it really comes down to that student loan plan, right? And a lot of people don't really know what their plan is for the student loans until they're getting their first job out of residency. Because a lot of it's dependent on that job. Does that job qualify for public service loan forgiveness? Because if you're working, you're a direct employee of 501c3, or even if you contract with a 501c3 in Texas or California, you qualify for public service loan forgiveness. And while this isn't going to be the case in the future, right now, pretty much all of today's residents The only loans they have are federal loans. They're eligible for public service loan forgiveness. So you really can't make that decision of whether you're going to go for that or plan to pay off your loans until you know what job you're going to take after residency. And so it's a little bit early to be, paying them off, because why pay off loans that someone else is going to pay off? If the taxpayer is offering to pay off your loans, you should let them do it. And so most of the time, if you have some extra money by some miracle during residency, you should probably be investing it or using it to improve your life. Residency is not necessarily the time to get rich. Residency is the time to learn, put together some plans, and that most important year of your financial life is really your first year as an attending. So I like residents to hit the ground running as they graduate with a written plan for those first 12 paychecks. So they actually know where the money from their first 12 paychecks is going to go, how much to student loans and how much to investments and how much to, saving up a house down payment or an emergency fund or replacing that beater they've been driving for 8 years or whatever, right? But I want them to have a plan when they hit the ground, when they finish residency, rather than trying to somehow squirrel away tons of money as a resident. You're just going to save way more money your first year as an attending than you probably will the entire way through residency.
Now you mentioned that, and one thing that you've always talked about is your first few years live like a resident. Kind of for those that may not have been listening or checking out the podcast 10 years ago. They may have still been in middle school at that point, honestly, with some of these young physicians. And talking about that idea that just because you have the full attending board eligibility, board certification after your name once you get into part of the year, that you may not want to just go out and all of a sudden get the physician lifestyle.
Yeah, I think the key is to avoid that lifestyle explosion. For most emergency docs, you get one raise in your life. It's when you come out of residency, and that's it. Beyond that, you're probably not increasing your income dramatically from, at least not after the first couple of years out anyway, once you make a partner in a group or whatever. And so you've got to not grow into that income immediately. And that's the natural tendency that most people will do. Without some sort of a plan, most people will grow into their income within a year or two. And so I try to get people to drag their feet a little bit. Their income is their greatest wealth building tool, and they want to harness it. And the easiest time to do that is when you're used to living a lifestyle like what a resident's been living. You're already used to this. It's no big deal to continue it for another year or 2 or 3 or heck, give yourself a 50% raise, right? That would be huge in corporate America to get a 50% raise. Give yourself a 50% raise. Live on $90,000 when you come out of residency and use the rest of that income to really build wealth, to pay off your student loans within 2 or 3 years, or to catch up to your college roommates as far as retirement savings, to get your emergency fund, to save up a house down payment, all those priorities you have early in your career. You can do them all at once if you'll just keep living like a resident for a couple of years after residency.
Now, coming at you a little bit from my president-elect side of ACEP and dealing with the subgroup of the board that we just worked on, some of the group dissolution or the group breakdown plans. And, we've had 2 groups now, NES and APP, that have both collapsed. Both of them really screwed the docs on the way out the door. And, what you find there, of course, is the recognizing that, when you find yourself without a job, if you're without a job, pending you don't get transitioned to the next group, how long does it take to get credentialed at a new hospital? And of course, a lot of the folks here finding out they're going to have to pay for tail coverage. Thoughts on the idea that for young physicians now, you never want to plan that your group is going to fall apart. But it's going to happen. We're going to see more groups collapse at some point. Recommendations on going ahead and self-investing or putting that money in a place that if it falls apart, still sucks, still terrible, but you at least have that opportunity to have a buffer for a few months and then even potentially cover a tail.
Yeah, I mean, this is the problem with living on the edge, right? Any tiny little thing screws up your plan. Whereas when something big comes along, like job loss, it's almost hopeless when you're not, building significant wealth as you go along, when you don't have emergency funds, et cetera. Typically, an emergency fund is classically 3 months worth of what you spend. But the truth is, your disability insurance, if you have just regular long-term disability insurance, you're not going to get your first payment from that until 4 months, because it doesn't pay for the first 3 months, and then it pays you at the end of the month. So you really need at least 4 months just to cover you from a disability. And re-credentialing and getting a license in a new state is basically a 6-month process. So if you really do have to change jobs, it could be as long as 6 months that you're living without income. And so it argues for a little bit more liquidity, a little bit larger emergency fund, and that ought to be a pretty serious priority in the first year or two out of residency, is getting that emergency fund up to about 6 months worth of spending, and then you can absorb things like this. Now, tail coverage, a lot of people don't realize, it's expensive. It's usually 2 to 3 times what your annual premiums are. I remember when I joined my group, they had a claims-made policy. It wasn't an occurrence policy at that time. Now it is, but they had a claims-made policy. And while I was negotiating the contract, we were trying to decide who was going to pay for the tail. And we ended up deciding if they fired me, they had to pay for the tail. And if I quit, I had to pay for the tail. And I asked, well, how much is the tail? And the managing partner didn't know. He'd never priced a tail before. So he went back to the insurance company and found out it was about $50,000.
Yeah, that's the number I typically hear.
And this was 15 years ago. You know, maybe it's even a little bit more now, but I think insurance has generally come down in cost over the last 15 years. But it's not a small sum of money.
And we've seen people
and going
pushing,
without it's, you know, rolling the dice for sure.
We've seen numbers anywhere from the mid-30s up to a 6-figure in terms of paying for that tail coverage for these docs that are out there. And I think that's huge. I mean, that because theoretically, as we come out as physicians, we don't want to think that, one, we're going to make a bad choice, or two, that the company we're going into does not have our best in mind. And we've seen it with both of these groups. They had no problem completely screwing the docs on the way out the door. And, you know, the idea of, at least at that point, it's cheaper, because you don't have as many years behind you, as much potential risk to the insurer. And so being able to front load that and being able to pay that off on the front, it'll make you much more comfortable, save you a lot more stress down the road. All right, now we're through the early part of our career, and your other talk here was how to make money and grow your wealth through investments. And I think we're all a little bit, you know, we hear things, and I think as physicians, we think since we're physicians, we're probably great at investments as well. I know that I'm not, but tell me about some of this idea of investments and where docs can actually make some progress.
Yeah, the 2 talks I did here at the Scientific Assembly, the first one was aimed at, you know, early career docs, and this second one was aimed more at mid and late career docs. So we talked about lots of issues that were more relevant to mid and late career docs, and specifically investing. And what a lot of people don't realize until they kind of get into personal finance and investing is that investing is actually the easiest part. Mm-hmm. You know, it's the part everybody stresses over the most, and it's the part that's sexiest and the part that people talk about the most, but it's actually the easiest part. You can really have very simple investing plans, and that's completely adequate. You know, if you fund it adequately and stick with it long term, you can have an incredibly simple investing plan. And it'll work to reach all of your goals. You know, it can be as basic as investing in 2 or 3 index funds. And that's literally all you have to do to be successful as an investor. Now, there's lots of other things you can invest in. There's all kinds of ways to invest in real estate. And obviously, anybody who bought Bitcoin back in 2012 is really glad they did, right? You can invest in some of these more speculative investments. But you don't have to invest in any of that stuff. You can invest in some pretty boring stuff, same stuff every month. And the key is actually more about being the right kind of investor than getting the right kind of investment. And what I mean by that is you got to be somebody that invests every month. When you get paid, you put some money in your investments. You get paid again the next month, you put some money in your investments. When the market goes down, you don't panic sell, you know, and sell low after buying high. You stick with the plan over the years. And actually being the right kind of investor matters far more than the actual investment you select.
It's interesting because I've actually, for the last about 15 years, have just had a little bit of the check go into a little investment account, little few $100 just every month. Go in there and it just act like it doesn't even exist. And, you know, before you know it,
it's real money.
It's real money.
Yeah.
It's doing all right. And for me, it's a lot of the cushion. You know, it's when it starts to get tighter, you know, because since I'm on a pure payment-based or RVU-based model, you know, and Blue Cross Blue Shield or whoever decides to hold and not pay and drops my check in half. You know, it's good to have that cushion just in case you needed it down the road. More peace of mind than anything else. As folks get, I mean, now that emergency medicine is kind of fully mature in terms of the breadth of age of our physicians, you know, from everything from those just starting to those that have retired, what are some of the things that our retiring physicians or nearing retiring physicians should do in terms of their investments in order to make sure it's working for them, but also protecting them with the fluctuations and volatility of the market?
Well, a few things. One is obviously you need to be financially literate. You need to understand what it takes to retire. Even something basic like how much money makes you financially independent. This is a mystery to a lot of people, but it's basically 25 times what you spend in a given year, right? This comes from reverse engineering the 4% guideline. And you know, so if you spend $100,000 a year, you need $2.5 million. If you spend $200,000 a year, you need $5 million. If you spend $300,000 a year, you need $7.5 million. You know, just a lot of people aren't sure how much they need to retire as they approach retirement. So I think that's very helpful. A lot of people find out they have way more than they need, and other people realize they got some work to do.
Yeah, I'm still going to be working. Yeah, right.
So that's probably the main thing. But another issue people don't realize is something called sequence of returns risk. And this is the risk that despite having an adequate average return throughout your retirement, if the crummy returns come first, you can run out of money. And so the way most people deal with that is they take a little bit less risk with their investments starting about 5 years before they retire and for the first 5 years of retirement. And that way, if the markets really crash right at that most critical time in your investing career, it impacts your portfolio a little bit less because you have a less volatile portfolio. And so that's one way to protect against this sequence of returns risk, is to just take a little bit less risk with your investments. You know, maybe a little less money in things like stocks and real estate and a little more money in things like bonds.
With getting close to retirement, you know, and though nobody with MD or DO after their name should be leaning on Social Security by any stretch of the imagination, but just kind of, is there any hints or tips with regard to the tax implications of if and when you start to accept the Social Security checks age-wise, or the potential that you're still working and making money? You know, kind of give us some tips in those 60s on things you should do and mistakes you want to avoid.
Yeah, well, the first thing is Social Security. If you're in good health, like most physicians are, and you expect to live a reasonably long time, it makes sense to delay Social Security to age 70. Social Security is the best deal out there as far as annuities or pensions go. That pension, for lack of a better word, is indexed to inflation, unlike just about anything else you can buy from an insurance company these days. And the calculations for it are better than if you go to an insurance company and try to buy a similar annuity. They actually work out better for you. So delaying Social Security is your best possible annuity for most people. So that means not taking it until 70. So that means you need something else to live on if you're going to retire before 70 that you can live on until you get to age 70, and that usually means that nest egg that you've been saving up throughout your career. But another move that people tend to do in those years between when they retire and when they start taking Social Security, whether you retire at 55 or 60 or 65 or whatever, is to do a few Roth conversions, to move money from your tax-deferred accounts into your tax-free or Roth accounts, basically prepaying the taxes at a known tax rate, and then having a little bit more money in those tax-free Roth accounts that's not subject to required minimum distributions that you can use to kind of set your tax rate manually on purpose during your retirement years, and that can be pretty helpful to people. But that's probably the number one tax move for those, pre-retirement and just after retirement years.
And at that point, pending they don't have the knowledge background that you have, haven't really gone through all of the resources that you have available. Thoughts on having somebody in the financial world that can help you navigate that and see where you're going to maximize?
Yeah, clearly some doctors are do-it-yourselfers. They love this stuff. They're hobbyists. They'll read a financial book on vacation. They think it's great. But that's not the majority of docs. Most docs would be better off finding somebody that gives good advice at a fair price and following that advice. Now, the fair price is more than lots of people like to recognize. It's probably $5,000 to $15,000 a year. So it's not free, it's not even cheap, but it's worth it if you're not going to pay enough attention that you're doing this stuff right yourself. It's worth it to pay that to somebody else to make sure you're making the right moves, because it doesn't take very much, correction in order to make up for $5,000 to $15,000. When you're a doc on the eve of retirement, and presumably at this point you've got millions of dollars, and screw-ups can cost a lot of money at that point.
All right, you mentioned a couple of minutes ago you you expect to live for a long time. And I've skied with you out here. I've seen how good you are. I feel like the points down, and you're still leaving us in the dust. I mean, it wasn't a great snow day when we were up there. What year was it? Solitude?
I think so.
Yeah.
I think so.
And it was a groomer day just because the snow wasn't great that year. But you were blasting us away. But you've had an instance here where you bumped into somebody at the American College of Emergency Physicians that you had a close interaction with recently when you tried to cash in on your disability and retirement and whatever accounts and maybe life insurance at the same time. What happened to you?
Well, about a year ago, I took a nasty fall at about 12,000 feet on the north face of the Grand Teton. I was up there rock climbing, and two emergency physicians came to my aid. I ended up taking about a 35-foot fall, knocking myself out, giving myself a Lefort 3 fracture of the face, and I was hanging upside down at the end of a rope, leaking blood and CSF from my face, unconscious. So my climbing partner, emergency physician Christian Feinauer, climbed to my aid, carefully turned me upright, helped me regain consciousness, got me back to the belay ledge, and picked up his phone and got us out of there. We were flown out of there 200 feet below a helicopter for about 6 miles at the end of a rope. And then I was loaded into a medevac helicopter and taken to Eastern Idaho Regional Medical Center where Dr. Clint Van Hoff met me. I have no memory of actually interacting with him at the hospital, but he sutured up my face and reduced a wrist fracture and got me the scans and the care and the follow-up I needed. And so I'm very grateful to emergency physicians for being there in my time of need.
And then you actually bumped into Clint here?
Yeah, Clint was here at the Scientific Assembly.
And he recognized you?
He got a standing ovation. I mean, he was standing and the crowd was giving him the ovation. But,
he was inside your talk.
He came to my talk yesterday, and it was great to see him.
That's fantastic. Well, I'm glad you're doing well. It's always great to see you and catch up with everything, and hope to see you next year in Chicago. I mean, you're going to have to drive a little bit earlier if you're going to get there, if you're going to commute. Watch out. I heard the Kansas State Police, they're pretty tough on speeding too, so just be careful on the drive over there. How can folks get in touch with you? Where can they find information, especially with the resources that you have with the White Coat Investor?
Well, we try to package up everything into whatever format you like to learn it in, whether it's video or audio or written or email or books or whatever. It can all be found at whitecoatinvestor.com.
All right. Appreciate it. Thanks again for coming in. As for me, contact me, rstanton@acep.org, rstanton@acep.org, or at EverydayMed on X, and make sure that you're downloading all of the episodes onto your favorite podcast player. And until next time, I'm Ryan Stanton, and this has been some ACEP Frontline.
And in the silence, you will show me who you are.
If you're not on the front lines, you're on the sidelines.